Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Change Doesn't Have to Suck podcast. I'm Jasmine.
I'm Alistair.
And we have a special guest today. Dr. John Lambert joins us. This is our first guest on the pod. And if you are watching us right now on YouTube, you will notice this is our first time live on screen.
It is.
Alistair usually has a hard audio only rule. But for our special guest, we thought that we would do a video as well because this topic is probably the most excited I have been all year. Granted, I did do a little bonus episode a few weeks ago now where I talked about my debrief of some healthcare conferences that I'd been to, where Dr. John, I saw you not once but twice. And I thought, my goodness, this guy not only gets it, he is absolutely leading the way of what should be done, of what appears to be groundbreaking thinking in human-centered design, but it's not groundbreaking, is it, Dr. John? It's actually something that's been around for 50 plus years.
Absolutely. So, and look, thank you for the privilege of inviting me to this. I didn't realize it was going to be your first video and first guest appearance. I would have picked a better background if I'd known that. But no, look, to your point, I think it is interesting from my perspective. I've been doing human-centered design, not necessarily by that name, for over 40 years myself. The science behind it started in engineering, in human factors and cognitive science. Apple sort of were the first publicly recognized company that really used human-centered design with their Macintosh that came out in 1984. So from my point of view, this is all old news. It's all well-proven scientific methodology, but it seems that the larger and more government-orientated the organization you look at, the less they know about human-centered design and the more they regard it as something a bit out there that they're a bit scared of.
Absolutely. And we're here to tell you that it doesn't have to be something you're scared of. And change doesn't have to suck. Change should be awesome. Your words before we started the pod.
Change should be awesome.
It should be awesome. But before we launch into a whole heap of questions, which today's topic for our podcast listeners is about co-design and how to do that effectively and why it's so important and not a nice to have. But I want to just quickly share some of your credentials with everyone listening in. So you are a unique unicorn in that you are a doctor, a qualifying doctor, but you're also, in your words, a technologist, and you've been working in both spaces for a very long time. And it's because of that, I'm putting, you can talk to yourself, obviously, John, but you've worked in some very large government organizations all across Australia in multiple states and in a very complex environment being healthcare. So no one is more qualified to talk about, doing this in really complex spaces than yourself. So we're really grateful to have you.
I'm careful with things like unicorn or no one, but yeah, look, I do feel a little bit unusual. There's not too many people that have multiple decades of experience in both areas. There's a lot of people who go into digital health who spent a bit of time as a doctor who've done a lot of digital, and there's a lot who've been doctors for a long time and just have a superficial understanding of digital. But to be somebody who has actually built circuit boards and physical hardware, then software development from assembly language through BASIC through the later generation languages, as well as going through med school, specializing in two specialties, anesthesia and intensive care, and then actually working as a coalface doctor for multiple decades, including as a manager or a director of an intensive care unit. That is a bit unusual. And the other thing that's a bit weird is that I did a lot of my software development in healthcare anyway before I was a doctor. So I was writing practice management solutions in community-based practice, and a lot of people don't appreciate the difference between practicing as a clinician, not just a doctor and nurse, allied health, in the community in your own little private practice versus running a health system at a state level. And as you point out, I've had the good fortune to be involved in the largest state in New South Wales with the massive complex digital all the way down to the smallest in Northern Territory. So it's been that diversity, I think, is my perhaps more unique value proposition. Although there are lots of great people who have experience in clinical and digital and contribute to this. It's not a one-man shop, that's for sure.
Oh, it's amazing. Well, I hope we touched on today, I guess, why human-centered design is kind of the, I don't want to say silver bullet, but it is the game changer in all of these contexts. And co-design, which we're here to talk about today. So I know Alistair's busting to ask you some questions and I've been taking up all of the airtime so far. But let's jump straight into it, if that's okay. So consultation, that's a word that's used often. And it's used by change management professionals as well, so our peers. But it's often a tick box exercise. And what we see happen, and I'm sure you've seen it a million times, we've seen it a million times, is that the tech or the change, whatever that may be, rolls out and it doesn't land at, on the ward floor, essentially.
Right.
And that's because it was just a tick box exercise. So we're here to kind of unpack that and demystify that a little bit today, and talk about why co-design is almost a must-have if you're doing these kind of projects. So,
So can just before we switch, Sal, you used a specific word there, which is a really interesting one, consult, right?
Yes.
Because in recent times, I've generally favoured the word engagement, but it was actually very recent, and I mean seriously in the last 6 months, that I actually looked into a little bit more detail about the use of the word engagement. And I stumbled across this thing generated by the International Association for Public Participation. They call them the IAP squared for obvious reasons. There's 2 Ps in that acronym. And they talk about engagement in 5 different levels. And the lowest level being informing people. So you just, I'm going to do this thing, just suck it up. And then consultation is only just above that. So you use the word consult. And this, interestingly, a lot of people think that consultation is about getting their input to shape what is about to happen. But that's not strictly speaking true. Consultation is, I'll tell you what I'm doing. I'll open it for your comments, but I'm under no compulsion to do anything with your feedback, which is different to involvement, where I'll still write it, but I'll take your input as a real influence to what I'm writing and change what I do, which is different again to collaboration. Let's both hold the pen and write this thing together. And when I say write this thing, I don't just mean documents, let's design this thing. Let's create this thing together. And there's one level higher again, which is empowerment. I'm not going to be in charge. You're going to be in charge. And I think great design happens when you get as close to empowerment as possible, where the clinicians or the administrative staff in healthcare who are going to use this system have as much power as you can give them to define their own destiny and to define their own future. And so I find those 5 levels of engagement, which, are not mine, but I took from the IAP squared, is a really nice way of stratifying engagement. And interestingly, consult is almost at the bottom. So part of the problem is we consult, and consultation's not enough for good design. Yeah. Sorry, Alice. I hope I didn't steal your thunder.
Totally fine. And I think I love that you framed it that way, because for me, the way in which you engage with different individuals as you're working through co-design and trying to get some sort of engagement from ground zero all the way through to we're doing this together and now I'm empowering you, a lot of it actually shapes the way you speak with specific people. So from my perspective, I have some questions when you're looking at, you've been on a ward and there is a new project rolling out and you are very aware of the individuals who might be those toxic resistors that we would talk about. And you're very aware of those people who are going to be your sort of natural adopters and your change champions. And we use this language all the time. But the reason the language I think is dubbed is because they are genuine individuals who have certain biases towards change or not. And from your perspective, when you're looking at that framework of how much do I need to engage with you to get this change through, what are your tips on navigating through the toxic resistor versus getting the change champion involved? Because I think, and you can use the context of healthcare if you'd like, because I think there's a natural, as someone who's looking at co-design, you think differently than maybe some other managers or individuals would in the healthcare space.
Absolutely. Yeah. Look, interestingly, it was a colleague of mine who has deep expertise in this area, and he's specifically trained in human factors and business psychology, etc. Tom Loveday. Be worth having him on your session one of these days as well, I think. But he talks about evidence-based decision-making as opposed to opinion-based decision-making. So everybody has an opinion. And interestingly, in healthcare, it's a very hierarchical system. So naturally, the professor's opinion has more weight than the senior doctor, has more weight than the registrar, has more weight than the resident, the intern, and somewhere in there, you've got nurses and allied health and admin staff and everything. And a lot of the time, the loudest and most forcefully, espoused view is the one that gets the gurney, right? And it's a really bad way to make decisions, especially because the more senior you are, the less connected you are with what actually happens on the ground. And a lot of the systems we roll out are mostly used by people at the coalface who do the work, not by the senior bosses and the managers. Or there are different elements of the system. So there's the bit where you put the data in, which might be the coalface nurse, the intern, the resident, and then there's the bit where you view and analyze the data and make decisions, which might be the nurse unit manager and the specialist in charge, right? So, and by the way, that's one of the reasons we talk about human-centered design rather than user-centered design, because people forget that there are people impacted by the design of any system, computer, building, model of care, whatever, that are not directly using the system, especially when you think of software. You know, patients are a massive stakeholder, but they don't use an EMR or a practice management system, maybe a portal, but that's about it. So, but the design has to understand their needs, right? So it's more about the empathy. But look, getting back to your specific point, the methodologies of true human-centered design actually are evidence-based. So rather than saying, what do you think is the best way to do this? It's, here are two different ways of doing this. Let's measure which one's more efficient. And the funny thing is that the opinionated toxic people who might be leaders, who might be co-health workers, when they participate in this, especially in healthcare, I think, because it's such a science-based industry, they see intuitively that something works better than another. And because it's evidence-based, it's not personal. So they might think this is the way we should do this. They get involved in a wireframing session or a think aloud session or any of the human-centered design methodologies. And they see that at the end of it, actually, this other way is a better way of doing it. But they can look at it and say, well, it's not so much that it disagrees with me. It's just the evidence says that that's the most efficient way to design this thing. So it diffuses a lot of that opinion-based rhetoric. So I've seen that repeat in multiple environments, multiple contexts, small startups, massive enterprise, and it's a repeatable feature of proper human-centered design. So I think that's how you get around it. You take the heat of personal opinion out of it to make it evidence-based.
And I think for anyone listening, it's a really nice way of thinking about those individuals that often you go, oh my goodness, I wish they would just work with us on this, or maybe they are being a bit toxic in the opinion they're pushing out about the change. But there is a very natural way, and I think healthcare is a great example, but I'm sure there are multiple other specialties we see where you actually start putting some facts and some evidence in front of everyone, and you put it on the table for everyone to see, right? Everybody gets to see it. And if there's one individual who's going, well, actually, I'd rather go with the more inefficient option just because it suits me, and that one's a bit, not that the route I want to take, it makes it very difficult for them to stay on that high horse or their opinion or their squeaky wheel, because you have this natural, well, everyone can see which option is more efficient, or if it's not efficiency based, if it's more a better customer experience, a better, you're talking from healthcare, better client experience when they're moving through an ED or similar, right? There has to be that focus. So I think it's an interesting and really useful tip to start going, well, let's look at from human-centered design and starting to co-design this space. Let's look at diffusing those opinions, the negativity about a change, and start looking at real facts and real data, which is something we base ourselves in a lot. And
I think you do need to be careful to not a strongly voiced opinion versus toxic behavior are two different things. And you can be negative and critical without being toxic. And we've kind of been a bit loose with that terminology so far. But I just want to draw out that this does require you to manage toxic behaviors and eliminate them from the process. There's only so much you can do with somebody who's actually really inappropriate, right? But assuming there's not toxicity or inappropriate behaviors or people literally lying or manipulating due to motivations that are not in line with the strategy or the objectives, then yes, everything I said I think would apply. But you still have to be careful, because if you get somebody who's truly inappropriate or toxic involved, it can do what that sort of person would do to any system, which is degrade the performance, and you won't get the outcomes you want. So, but in terms of strongly voiced opinions, and look, the other thing is the people with those strong voices and strong opinions, boy, if you can bring them into the tent and have them aligned, they are some of your most powerful change agents. They're really good. I mean, and everybody believes somebody who was a disbeliever who now believes, even more than the people who always believed.
It's one of my favorite things. When that happens.
Yeah. It was actually one of the questions I had as a follow-up to this was, have you then experienced a really positive experience of that person was, had some negative opinions? And do you have a good example of, because people often can recognize and see the pattern but then putting it into practice themselves is harder. So if you've
Yeah.
got this
Look,
experience, and this is how I could explain it.
It's probably more of a vibe thing. So in my practice management experience, I was often going to sites that already had a practice management solution, and they were switching solutions. And it was more in the language of, oh my God, I didn't know that a PMS could work this way. I didn't know that this could be this simple. I was always told that the way we did things was wrong because the old practice management system didn't support the way we wanted to do things. Using your system has shown us that it can be designed to fit our pathway. And so, my view from my experience selling to hundreds of practices in practice management is that there were core things that all of them required, but the way they got to it, the pathway that they each chose was different. And you couldn't, like some practice management solution vendors say, oh, there is definitely one best way of doing this. And I call BS on that. I've seen many different pathways that are perfectly appropriate to their context.
Yes.
And if you support them all, people like your software. If you don't support them all, they're going to hate what you do because there's always going to be friction. So I've got plenty of examples from that part of my life, which is early on in my software development years when I was actually cutting code. Later, we had some experience in New South Wales when we first introduced not pure human-centered design, but we sort of improved on existing practices that weren't creating great solutions. And it required, it was too complex to go into perhaps here, but there are a lot of very suspicious clinicians involved. And this project was about creating a single page for you to help manage insulin and other drugs that put your sugar up and down. And the clinicians were very suspicious about all of this. But as they got involved in the process and as they participated in the design tasks, increasingly they were just saying, oh my God, this just makes sense. This is just how you should do it. Like, you didn't have to explain to them. They just have to participate. And that's sometimes the hardest thing. You'll get into in a big organization, you get into all this trouble with, executive sponsorship and support and people pushing back because it's just changing to a different way of designing things. I'm not talking about the thing you're trying to change. But when you get into it and actually start doing design work and sit in a room with somebody who understands human-centered design and have a bunch of representative users telling you what their experience of a workflow is and what it might look like, they all just say, oh, this is amazing. This is fun. This is amazing. And it just changes their behavior. So I sort of feel like saying, shut up, everybody. Don't worry about the detail. Just come to this and do this. And afterwards, we can talk about whether you like it or not, because it always wins. And that's been my universal experience of implementing HCD in healthcare, large and small, is that clinicians especially, and I mean all clinicians, I don't mean doctors, I mean nurses, doctors, allied health, and non-clinicians in healthcare, they just see proper human-centered design as just being the obvious logical thing to do. And it kind of, as a doctor, it's got some similarities in the way we learn and conduct healthcare as well. So I think there's a real ease of adoption if you're prepared to give it a go. The problem is the senior management and the tiers above, they're the ones that struggle with it because they see, well, it is kind of interesting because they see, despite the fact that so many of our IT projects fail often because the system doesn't fit the need, they see spending the time to do proper design as costing money and causing delay. And they don't appreciate, I mean, there's this great little saying in human-centered design about usability testing, right? So this is testing how usable a solution is. And the saying goes, is you can never not have usability testing. The only choice is, do you want to do it before or after go live?
Yes.
And so we roll out these systems and then we do the usability testing after go live because they've never shown it to a user before and it's disastrous. But it's after go live. We can't undo it. We can't roll back. We didn't plan on rolling back. It's all a nightmare, right? Whereas you just shift that thing to before go live and already you're ahead of the 8 ball, right? And you argue with them, like fixing a system that's broken when it's live and in use is so much harder than fixing it before it goes live. So there's all these little things. There's 100 little examples of why doing proper HCD saves money, creates more successful projects, all the rest of it. And yet, ironically, the biggest complaint you have is, oh, it'll slow us down, it'll cost more. We've got to have these design teams. And everybody ignores the massive ongoing costs of bad systems in use across all of health.
Oh, millions of dollars being
Oh,
wasted
I'd
every
say
year.
worldwide, probably billions. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting for anyone that wants to go back to the bonus episode that I mentioned earlier. It was actually that panel you were hosting at Australian Healthcare Week, where I asked the question about the cost of not doing this process. And the panel said, it's 4x the cost. If you just do proper design at the start, you will save money after go live. You will get the adoption. You will be able to realize those benefits that you're chasing. So
And that wasn't
not a
me.
cost.
I didn't answer that question. I think they
No,
answered it all for me.
They did. But I'm loving this conversation, and particularly, I've sort of had a light bulb moment as we've been talking, and I've been on the HTD bandwagon for a very, very long time, and used to do this in other organizations. But that first bit of co-design and getting those people who have probably got their strong opinions and their resistance to bring them on that journey of empathy and thinking like a human for other humans. It's very interesting to say you almost have to take the emotion out and just put the science in front of them. Let the science do the talking to then let that empathy come in, and the rest is history kind of thing.
This is kind of ironic, isn't it? You've hit on one of the most amazing key elements that if I explain nothing else about human-centered design to people, I say the most important thing is true empathy. Because if you're writing something for yourself, and this is where AI makes it different with people can vibe code and do things themselves. If you're writing it for yourself, of course you understand yourself deeply. So you're going to create a great solution. So this is why a lot of doctors create good practice management solutions, but it's only for them. It's not for all doctors. They really only understand themselves, or maybe their practice, but not everybody's practice. So the art is allowing people who are not you to understand you so deeply that they can create a solution for you. Because generally the programmers and designers are not the doctors and nurses who are doing the job, right? If there were thousands of people like me, it'd be easy, right? So your empathy thing is so cool. But you know what the biggest problem I've seen repeated? If you're going to have empathy, wonderful. But who are you empathizing with?
Yes.
Who are the people that you need to understand? These are the stakeholders, the broader user group, the humans in the design process, right? The biggest mistake I have seen repeatedly made is people do not sit down and consciously think about all the humans involved in a workflow. Oh, this workflow just involves doctors. No, it doesn't. It involves doctors, nurses, allied health, a ward clerk. Hang on, there's an administrator involved over there. Let's not forget the patient. And when you build a proper stakeholder map for a particular process, it's always bigger than people think it is initially. And we've had a number of projects where we've just asked the people who want some widget or something to write that list. And they give us a list. I was like, this is not the list. We sit with them, work through the problem and say, so who does this? Oh, this step. Who does that step? Oh, there's the list.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Two things will happen. One, they either have a much better understanding of the problem, they go away and think about it a bit more, and really they come back with a completely different problem statement. Or two, they say, this is actually a much bigger problem than we thought it was. We're not up for that. So it sort of self-filters out the projects that aren't worth doing.
Yes. Well, to extend on that as well, John, our organization, one of our core values is boots on the ground. And this comes from my HCD background as well, in that I see this mistake happening time and time again. Even if you have the list, you are making assumptions on those stakeholders, which you may not know. You can only know if you ask the people, or be a fly on the wall, even better, and watch them in their natural habitat, so to speak, doing
100%.
the workarounds, doing, what does a day in the life
work
look
as
like?
done versus work as imagined, all of the rest of it. Yep.
Correct. And there is a big disconnect from, dare I say it, the Ivory Tower, from, all of those stakeholder groups, particularly the ones you don't think about or know about, such as a patient in this experience. So
you have to do all of it. There's no question. I mean, I 100% agree with you. It's just that if you don't even know who the people are, then you can empathize all you like with the ones you've got. But if they aren't the right people, you're never going to have a great solution,
Correct. Well, as we anticipated, we could talk about this topic all day, but we do have more questions. And I think this one that you're looking at, Alistair, is a good one.
Well, the way I was actually framing it, the way you guys navigated through that part of the conversation, it's interesting that you landed at where is the choke point in some of this thinking. And there was two thoughts that I'm going to riff on. One was, and we just discussed it, do we understand the humans that this is impacting and all of those stakeholders, and have we seen boots on the ground, what their day looks like? The other chokehold was that management layer, and I'm going to reflect on some project work Jazz and I have been looking at, and there is this natural aversion to doing the investment upfront that we just talked about. And I would love, from your experience, especially in healthcare, have you seen any successful methods of working with that management layer for them to actually acknowledge and say, no, we really actually want you to go back and invest upfront. We want you to do the right change management, the right HCD, the right understanding before you even kick off. And
do it right the first time.
I mean, that's Jazz's favorite saying genuinely is do it right the first time. And she says it often, but it's so hard from our perspective to get that buy-in sometimes, because people say, you know, I'm ready to just get started. Let's do it. We already know what we're doing. Yeah, but do you know the way it's going to impact the people that you're rolling this out to?
I'd have paid $1 for every time somebody said that. And when we start the process, you realize they've got no idea. Look,
exactly.
It is surprising how difficult that piece is. And what I would say, the best way to get the managers and executives on board is proven success. Until we have management and executive teams that are truly HCD aware, which will happen in time, I think, you know, over the next 3 decades, I would hope that there'd be greater awareness. And people like the Digital Transformation Agency at the federal government have done great work in this space. And in New South Wales, I don't know where you're based, but in New South Wales, there's an organisation called Service New South Wales that has done a lot of effectively HCD stuff. It's interesting, Jasmine, you talk about getting it right up front, whereas there is this tension between classic HCD, which is sort of finesse and get it right up front, versus iterative, agile, improvement. And I think the truth is a balance between the two is obviously ideal. That's also a problem because iterating is not the way of a waterfall project. So interestingly, pure HCD is actually better suited to waterfall, and yet those are the projects that are most least likely to use HCD. So it's really challenging. But Alistair, you have actually highlighted the area that I've actually experienced the greatest difficulty in very large organizations. And it's kind of ironic. In the small startup world, nobody would have a startup that didn't use HCD. But in big government, it's still considered, I've forgotten the term you used, Jasmine, earlier on, innovative or out there or,
groundbreaking.
Groundbreaking, that's it, groundbreaking. Gosh. And I keep working hard on that. And the other thing that has been missing, which has been my primary focus for the last decade, is how do we adjust the HCD that the startup does with the blank slate? I can do anything. I can write any app. I've got venture capitalist funding. I can do all this fun stuff. And I've got these high-performing quality individuals I've picked who are deeply invested in what we're doing, to the enterprise version, which is very different. We've got governance to be aware of. We've got politics. We've got funding constraints. We've got, I even have battles with people saying, but hang on, the project steering committee is supposed to be the ultimate authority for everything in the project. And you're telling me design governance should sit separate to project governance. Absolutely. The project should not decide whether a solution is appropriately designed. And they hate that loss of control. So, and again, Tom Loveday has helped me a lot with this. Together, we've iterated 3 times now on the actual, how does a design governance model fit in with a project governance? So it's not just the managers and the executives, it's the project methodology that you're fighting.
Yes.
So it's really challenging. And look, I've definitely had success on middle-sized and smaller projects. And interestingly, and I don't particularly want to advertise any particular EMR vendor, but one of the very successful American vendors that is quite popular use a methodology. Admittedly, their system is a configurable off-the-shelf system. It's not a blank slate design process, but configurable systems still need an awful lot of design. But their methodology is surprisingly similar to what Tom and I would call enterprise human-centered design. And we feel we can improve on it. And that's what we're doing in Tasmania, is sort of enhancing that. Because their focus is not surprisingly very vendor specific, and we feel that design should be vendor agnostic. And so there's another little interesting segue we could take in another session, the discussion about whether design should be product specific or function specific, and I'm very much in the latter camp, that I think you should design around the processes you need. It doesn't matter how many software or physical tools you're using. It should all take into account. And then look, I just triggered myself talking about configurable off-the-shelf systems. even a system that has no configurability whatsoever still requires design. Because what you're seeing is a balance between, are we designing the software or the physical device, or are we designing the humans that use it? And so there's a balance, a zone there. And so you know, a startup might be designing a solution to be frictionless for the user. Somebody's bought an off-the-shelf web-delivered thing that's not configurable. They've got to redesign their workflow in their business to match that tool. And configurable off-the-shelf systems are somewhere in the middle, right? So it's just it's a difference of focus, not a difference of need in design. You're just designing more the people than the process and technology, and vice versa. So that's another little nuance. But no, getting back to your issue, it's still in 2025. I can honestly tell you it's easier than it was in 2015. In 2015, when I talk about human-centered design, nobody had a clue what I was talking about. In 2025, most of the government executives will have heard of it, know it's a good thing, but still are scared of it.
Yes.
So maybe in 2035, we can have this podcast again, and I can say, I think it's now considered the default approach.
Well, it's really interesting actually on that. So just thinking about where we are today in 2026, and that is.
Sorry, I was out by you.
That's
Wasn't
okay.
I?
Just so we were timestamping the.
I was going for 2015 because that's when we started doing this in New South Wales. So I was going in tens from there. But you're right, we are in 2026. Yep.
Which was actually when I was working in a design practice myself. Anyway,
wow.
But I think what's really interesting as well, and I talk about this a lot in the media, about the changing of the guard in our workplaces, the generational shift that's happening. And we actually have more, this is a bit of a segue, more millennials and now Gen Zs coming through who actually care deeply about more of a social sort of impact and, you know, who am I as a person and how is this impacting me in my work? And it's interesting seeing that shift coming in as well. So I'm very hopeful. Hoping to sort of help championing this with you, John, but hopeful that by 2030 we are thinking HCD first and we are shaking off some of those old, dare I say it, PMO from the 80s structures that we're still living in, you know.
I don't think we have a choice though. And I think, John, you clearly are so passionate about that, but I actually don't think we have a choice. And there's a reason you've said, you know, a leading EMR vendor has decided that actually this is the principle they take forward. It's because their success and delivery rate must be reflecting that this is the right approach. And I love the nuances you're bringing to depending on who you're working with and, you know, the budget you've got and the constraints and all these things. They will guide where you land within the HCD spectrum. But I think we have to still consider this is the only way, because if we just throw it out the window and I'll look forward into that 10 years, you're going to have so much technical change in every facet of everyday life. There will need to be a focus on humans and the way in which we interact, the way in which we utilize the software, the way in which we utilize the hardware, which will be, in 10 years' time, will be something we can't even envisage right now. So it's all, while it's so critical to be using in a day-to-day life right now, and we're still projecting it's going to take government bodies and large enterprise some time to get there, it's nice to see that actually there's more and more people involved and there's more people thinking this way. And I know even in the projects we work in, every single time we are pushing for, yes, but do you understand the impact that's having to the client?
Agreed.
Do you understand the impact that that's having to the front line or your IT department, whoever it is?
And it's funny because a lot of people think AI is going to remove this need. I don't see that at all. In fact, all of the challenges I see with AI, especially in healthcare, if you actually just treated it like any other solution, physical or digital, and applied the same HCD process, you will always end up with a better functional solution, whether it uses AI or not. And so, yeah, I'm glad I'm inside one of the groups you talked about. I had to check just then, am I actually a Gen X? And I'm just a Gen X. But I grew up when, you know, assembler, hard coding, green screens, right? That was when I started programming. And my dad was punch cards, so I wasn't in that generation. But it hasn't changed. The process, in my opinion, even to today, with all the greatest, you know, generative AI and predictive AI solutions, it's really no different. And I've worked in an AI startup on that. And again, what I added to that company was mostly in this space of human-centered design. And
Mhm.
Doesn't matter how wonderful your AI model is, you've still got to integrate it with a real world workflow, because currently humans are still the effector arm for everything. Now, what will get interesting is when robots start doing more work. Like if the robots really are as good as what you see on some of the online videos, we're going to be getting into a very interesting world soon. But yeah, I'm
Yeah,
still
well,
mostly interested in
even
humans.
even more reason to understand what makes humans so unique and what the value is in the future as well.
Yeah, true.
You need
Yeah,
to
that's a
have
fair
more
point.
empathy.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I
Absolutely.
think it's something, the reason we're, as you are so incredibly passionate about this space, is I think it's becoming even more important as some of that workflow gets displaced from, the use of AI, and like you said, even more robotics comes into so many different areas. It will be even more important to understand the impact to the
I think
human
so.
side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we do have to wrap the podcast, but I thought maybe we
Chat
could
forever.
leave with a Dr. John gift to our listeners, which we were intending to talk about co-design. We touched on it a little bit, but let's just myth bust right now, John. How people have this perception that HCD and co-design, it's too hard, I can't do it. But it's not quite true, is it? You can implement co-design if you're a change manager or a project manager right now in the work that you're doing. And I want to go back to those layers of engagement that you spoke about before, and how maybe a practical way that people can implement this. Spoiler alert, I saw the blue gum transformation triangle in one of your presentations, and I think that was really eye-opening for people to see those different layers. And I think that's really easy to, I shouldn't say turn on like this, I'm clicking my fingers, but it's well within everybody's reach to do that kind of structure. So do you want to just quickly take us through what the everyday sponsor, change manager, project manager could do to be more closer to co-design than potentially they are today?
Well, I wasn't sure how I was going to answer your question. But in fact, you kind of gave me an out with talking about the IAP squared engagement model, because if you do nothing other than think about engagement in those 5 levels, from inform through consult, involve, collaborate, empower, maybe just try to go one step higher than where you are.
Yes.
Like, don't just inform, listen to what people say about what you've told them. Don't just listen, use the feedback to change what you're doing. If you're already doing that, why don't you go to the next step and actually do things collaboratively? So rather than saying, look, you're like most IT projects, I'm telling you you're going to use a different piece of software tomorrow. Well, that's pretty terrible, but that's at least informing, right? Don't expect them to go all the way to empower overnight, but maybe perhaps consult people, which already implies quite a significant change. Because if you're going to consult, you have to send out the material with a method of providing feedback. You need to allow a time frame for feedback. You need to work out what you're going to do with the feedback, even if you're not going to change your plan. So each step involves an additional layer of complexity, time, effort, and cost. So if people are already in the middle of a project, dramatic change, it's not going to happen. Like if they're already set up with the staffing levels, they've got the change allocation of budget and all the rest of it. So you can't just uplift that and go from inform to empower in one step. So that would be one thing I would suggest. The other takeaway message, I guess, is that human-centered design starts with a problem or a problem statement or a serious amount of thinking about what problem am I trying to solve. And this is the second problem you get into. Many projects fail because their scope is wrong. They're building the wrong solution. And we all talk about all the projects that don't have benefits measures. Why do they not have benefits measures? Sometimes it's because they aren't budgeted to actually measure the measures, but most of the time it's because nobody ever stopped to think, what does success look like? What thing can we measure to say this investment of this much money has created this much improvement in a measure that we measured before we did the project? Very few people do that. And that's about spending that time. So I talked before about trying to have empathy before you know who you have to have empathy with. Well, perhaps try to understand what problem you're trying to solve before you invest money in solving it.
And get a baseline. That's something I see.
Well, that's the point. I'm going even one step before that. Like before you can measure a baseline, you need to agree this is what should shift on the dial. Now measure the baseline. Absolutely. And that generally should happen before the project starts, before the business. Like, how do you write a business case without knowing what, like people say to me, oh, we want to digitize this form. Why do you want to digitize the form? Oh, well, the form currently takes an hour to fill. Well, actually, no, they don't say that. They say the form is complex and takes time. How long? Oh, I don't know. Go and measure it. Go back, time a few people filling out the form. It doesn't take long, actually. It's amazing, right? Okay, they come back to me. Oh, it takes an hour. Okay, so what does success look like? Well, what do you mean? Well, do you want the hour to be turned into 50 minutes, 5 minutes, 30 minutes? What would make a difference to your business? Oh, well, how will we decide it? Well, have a look at how much of it, are you trying to save staff time? Are you trying to deliver more services? Are you trying to cut staff? Oh, okay. And they go, and so then all of a sudden you come out of that discussion. Oh, actually, what we consider success is to reduce that hour to 20 minutes. We reckon if we get to 20, okay, great. What are you going to do if we do this project and we don't get to 20? What do you mean? Well, I said, well, if all your calculations are based on 20 minutes and you get 30 minutes, technically you've got a failed project. Are you prepared to invest more to get to 20 minutes? Oh, time goes by thinking, maybe not. Okay, well then 30 minutes is probably a better threshold because technically, if you haven't achieved your target, it's a failed project. You should pull it out. What? You can pull systems out after you turn them on? Well, if you're really being logical about this, you don't want to invest all that money and not solve the problem, do you? No, I guess not. It's all that thinking before the project that people skip. It's so easy to skip it. Oh, I've got a business case. Yes, but what thinking did you do before you wrote the business case? So yeah, so that I guess that's where I've seen repeated failure. And I have to be honest, that part, getting people to spend more time before the business case, generally executives and managers like, because from their perhaps more selfish point of view, it delays the need to make a decision to invest money. But while you're doing it, you can actually improve the quality and risk management of the money you invest. So it is a sensible thing to do. Sorry, I've probably gone up a bit off track there, but yeah.
And I'm glad you said risk, because we talk about this a lot as well, of that, co-design and human-centered design and effective change management isn't nice to have. It isn't soft. It isn't fun.
It's a risk management approach.
It's a
I
risk
agree with you
management
100%.
approach.
Yes.
And it's, you sharpen the axe for 6 hours so you can cut it down in 30 minutes kind of thing, that's our approach to things.
No, I do agree with that approach, and it is fascinating. You'd think that'd be a really strong argument.
Yes.
And again, it comes back to the measures that you were talking about, Alistair, the benefit measures, because we don't measure risk that well either. And so it's a lot of it's about perception. And another problem we have, and this comes from the teaching on that they often give company directors when you go to company directors courses. It's all very well to have a risk matrix, but what you need is a risk appetite statement. Yes. So every risk will come back, whatever rating it is. And I don't like ratings. I like likelihood and consequence kept separate, because then you can appreciate, because sometimes, a high consequence event means something different to a low, even though they come out at the same rate. But a lot of organizations don't say, we accept that risk in this context. It's a high risk. It's a catastrophic, not catastrophic, that's a consequence. Anyway, it's a red risk.
Yes.
But we know that is part of the job of being an interventional cardiologist. We know that 1 in 100 patients will die on the table. And that's not going to stop us doing interventional cardiology.
Correct. Yes.
Which is different to something else where you'd say, oh, well, there's that amount of risk is way above where we're comfortable. So people don't think about the appetite side of the equation. So that's the other problem. So we don't measure risk well, and people talk about risk all the time, but they don't talk about appetite. What risk are we happy to accept? And with those two failings, plus not spending enough time understanding the problem, and then not doing engagement to the level it really should be at, those three things are probably the most repeated mistakes I've seen.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm actually going to take that. I need to put some more risk thinking into a project I'm working on.
Speaking so many of our languages, everything, my brain is shooting off and also being triggered in many ways. So like you've hit on exactly the thing I'm combating right now, or exactly the framework I'm trying to break. Well, that's actually a good thing. If we've got such diverse backgrounds and we're all seeing the same reality, that probably means there's some truth in what we're talking about.
Absolutely. And we are in different parts of the country. To your question before, we are in Queensland. So I can tell you it is happening up here too.
Yeah.
All right. We do need to wrap, but I think there's lots of good takeaways for our listeners of this. And we've so valued your time, John. This has been fantastic. But I think if I can leave our listeners with this, co-design or human-centered design even is a power move. And for me, my big takeaway from this conversation is that you can look at that power move in two ways. One, it's just a better way to invest your very valuable, very finite project spend. Invest up front to get a better outcome at the end. We all know that's logical, but we're acting very illogically today. So consider that next time. And then the other thing, which we didn't touch on too much, but what does co-design, what is the shadow that casts for people who are brought into that, whether they're just informed, consulted, or, further up that engagement layer? I think people underestimate the symbolicness of that, because as humans, we are all different. But I think there aren't many people in this world that go, I don't want you to ask for my advice. I don't want you to ask about my experience. I don't want you to empathize with my day job. People actually really respect that.
I really like that perspective, because people talk about culture a lot, and I prefer to talk about behaviors, because culture is sort of hard to define, but you can video somebody's behavior, right? And so in a sense, what you're describing there is, by doing HCD embodies a behavior which promotes a good culture. We listen to you, we pay attention to you, we respect you. I really like the way you frame that. I really do, because and another, I think it works in parallel with what you've said, but I've often said to people, if you've got the people who are affected driving the future state, it makes your change workload much lower, because design is change, right?
Yes.
It's embodied in. So that's the other thing I was going to sort of add to what you're saying. So I love the spirit of what you're saying, and I would also say that it also saves you a lot of money in change management, because if the people create their future, then they're part of the change. Like, what do you have to educate them on if they've already been involved in designing the thing? You know what I mean?
Correct.
Plus, designing good things requires less education, because it's more intuitive and they know how to use it. So like, it's a win-win-win. I don't understand why.
It is a win-win-win. We will change 2030. No, 2027. No. All
I'm
right,
going
thank you
2035
so
and I'll
much.
still be happy.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us as our special guest today. Our first podcast, I think it went okay. We'll have a look at the footage afterwards. But really appreciate your time. It sounds like we should get you back. We should definitely get Tom on the pod as well. Hey, maybe if our listeners enjoyed this event, we could do something else. I don't know. But give us your feedback. Do whatever you do on your listening application. Let us know what you think. But very appreciative of your time. And maybe, just maybe, Alistair, we will change the name of the podcast to Change Should Be Awesome. Thank you for joining us, John.
Don't be so half-hearted about it. Change is awesome.
Change is awesome.
There it is.
I like it. Thank you.